They asked me to stand on the dot. And I'm really happy to be there. I'm actually very happy to be standing here because a terrible thing happened as I was traveling out here to give this speech. We took off in the plane, and the takeoff was fine. The cruise was fine, but as we were coming into land, the two most important control systems on the aircraft stopped working. And I'm not talking about anything minor. I'm talking about the throttle and the elevator. Now, the throttle is like the gas pedal on your car. You push it forward, the plane goes faster. You pull it back, the plane is supposed to go slower. And you can see if you're trying to take an aircraft that's traveling at 400 miles an hour and slow it down before landing, how the throttle might be really important to this activity. But it wasn't just the throttle that stopped working. The elevator, which there's no analogous system on a car, but the elevator determines if the plane goes up or down. And you can see if you're trying to get a plane to sort of softly contact the ground, how the elevator might be something you'd want to use. I mean, flying is really safe. It's the part where you hit the ground that's dangerous. And I was in an airplane where both of these control systems stopped working the way they normally work while we were landing. Now, fortunately, the pilots who were in control of the flight knew what to do in this situation. In fact, all pilots know what to do in this situation because if you're a pilot, one of the first things they teach you is that there is this invisible line. And there's this invisible line where the controls that you are normally used to working one way work a different way. And so I thought about this and how there are other invisible lines and how it's important to know if you're on one side or the other. And if you're a pilot, it turns out that there's no signal that the controls are about to start working a different way. It's something you have to memorize. As a matter of fact, before you're allowed to fly a plane, you have to memorize the airspeed at which the change occurs. And you learn how to handle this. And therefore, we can all fly safely. But there are other invisible lines. And if you don't know what you're doing, you can do the wrong thing or the right thing in the wrong time. And I think life and death examples make for good learning exercises. So I thought I'd tell you about a life or death example in the business that I'm in, at least one of the businesses, which was Square. And Square was a perfect candidate for a life or death example because when we were a startup, and we were a successful startup, but back in 2014, when we were still a very small company, we had the worst thing possible happen to us, which is Amazon wanted our business. Now, when Amazon wants the business from a startup, they don't call you up and negotiate something. They just decide that they're Amazon, they're going to copy your product, they're going to undercut your price, and they're just going to take it. And that's what Amazon decided to do. As a matter of fact, it's what they'd done to all startups that they'd ever wanted, and it had always worked. Back in 2014, when Amazon did this series of moves, they always won. And so we're in a life or death situation. And we were so terrified that we first looked for other companies that had beaten Amazon, found none, looked at the options we had for competing against Amazon. But if you're a tiny little startup and they're Amazon, there aren't too many options available to you. So we basically did nothing. Or I should say, we kept doing the things that we had always been doing. And in doing that, we actually won, which was amazing. The fight lasted about a year, and after a year, Amazon gave up. As a matter of fact, they did it in a really cool way. They actually mailed one of these little readers to all of their soon-to-be former customers. Pretty good outcome. But why? The question why always bothered me. What had happened? Well, it turns out that in business, there's also this invisible line, where things that you would think behave one way can behave a different way. And in the case of Amazon, when your competitor decides to undercut you on price, what you're supposed to do? You're supposed to match them on price. We didn't do that. When they make a big marketing storm, you're supposed to make a marketing storm of a similar caliber. We didn't do that. We didn't do a lot of the things, but one of the things we also didn't do was we didn't realize that we were on this side of the line. where things work differently. As a matter of fact, I didn't discover this until years after the battle was won, when I was trying to answer the question for myself, well, what the hell happened? And so I looked around for different companies, because I don't believe that these phenomena are unique. And I think if something happens to one company, it probably happened to other companies. And sure enough, if you look back in history, you'll find that there are literally hundreds of companies, tiny little firms, who were attacked by these very, very powerful foes, and somehow they won. And in each of these situations, not only did they win, but they became the most powerful companies in their industry. And it was because they were using a different set of physics. And I wanted to understand this physics. But more importantly, I wanted to understand why I had been ignorant of this phenomenon for my entire business career. I'd been making the same mistakes over and over. I figured somebody would have explained this by now. So I started looking for explanations, because it turns out I found examples throughout history. I found examples that were 100, 200 years old. So I figured, well, somebody must have explained this, right? But it turns out, at least in the English language, we're missing the word that allows us to differentiate one side of this line from the other. So think of a word in the English language that we can use to describe a business that is not doing what everybody else is doing, that is not copying. Do we have such a word? Innovator? Maybe. Outlier? Okay. Platypus. We used to have a word. It turns out the original meaning of the word entrepreneur was coined by an economist named Joseph Schumpeter to differentiate normal business from people who were doing things that had not been done before. And once I realized that there was this missing word, and once I realized the original definition of entrepreneur and what it meant, it started to clarify things. Now, entrepreneur is a great word if you use it in its original definition. But if we think about what that word means, a good example is sort of the Wright brothers. Were the Wright brothers entrepreneurs? I mean, they invented aircraft, so were they entrepreneurs? And the answer is not often, because they also ran a bicycle shop. And when they were running a bicycle shop, they were just regular business people. They were doing what other bicycle shops were doing. It was only when they were trying to invent an airplane, which was a series of innovations that had to be stacked one on top of another, that they were actually acting as entrepreneurs. But when I recognized that we originally had this word, all of a sudden I saw very clearly why I had been a failure for 20 years. Why the things that I was doing in my businesses were not working. Because I would have a problem in a business, and I would talk to my friend who was successful in his or her business, and I would say, hey, how do you solve this problem? And they would tell me how they did it. And I would go over, and I would try it. And the controls would work differently. And I would end up crashing into the ground. Married people know what I'm talking about, right? You try one thing, has this effect, whoops, right, okay. So I spent 3 years researching and then eventually deciding to write a book describing how the physics work on different sides of this invisible line in business. But I left something very important out of that book, and I'd like to correct that mistake tonight, which is the thing that unites everything in this room and answers the question that is most important, which is how do you know if you're on one side of this line or the other? So my question to you is, what unites everything in this room? What do we all have in common? I mean, forget the air molecules here, but like, what do we all have in common with this? Anything. Everything in this room. People, the red dot that I'm supposed to stand on, we're all copies. We're all successful copies. There's nothing original about this red dot. The nylon, this was not made by the DuPont company. The color red was, I mean, TED Talks are supposed to have red dots. The dot itself isn't even an original idea. And I'm standing on a stage that's made of plywood, and the plywood is made of trees, and the trees were copies of other trees from millions of years ago. None of us are original. And that's really good, because originality sucks. Innovation sucks. It is almost always a last resort. If you want to do something original, you are almost definitely going to fail. Now I know what you're saying. You're saying, well, not me, Jim. I'm original. I like to be innovative. And I do too. And we all kind of do that. And the reason we do that is because we've been trained by marketers who take hold of one of our most powerful urges. They sell us this sexy vision of what it's like to be original by harnessing our primal urge to just make another copy of ourselves. What I discovered was the people who were making these innovations were folks who had done normal things under exceptional circumstances. Essentially, they were the opposite of heroes. So what's the opposite of a hero? What's the opposite of a superhero? Is it a supervillain? Probably not. It's probably a normal person. Probably like us, like everyone in this room. People for whom doing something that is not familiar feels very uncomfortable. When you find yourself in a situation where you can't copy, you feel scared. And if you recognize that line, you will also see where the invisible line is between entrepreneurship and normal business, which is when you run out of options, the last thing you do is innovate and invent. So I wrote this book, and I dedicated it to a person who is incredibly talented and incredibly qualified and has 3 degrees from world-leading institutions, brilliant, smart, hardworking. This list of superlatives goes on and on. But when I've seen this person encounter situations where she doesn't know exactly how to solve the problem, she always hesitates. And she always says the same thing. I'm not qualified. I don't feel qualified to do this. So let's think about what it means to be qualified. So if you want to fly a plane, you should be qualified, right? And if you want to go fly a plane today, you go out to St. Charles Flying Service, you give Dennis $5,000, and he will teach you ground school. He will run you through a series of exercises. He will put you in with an instructor, and he will run you through a set of things that make you a qualified pilot. But when Orville and Wilbur Wright flew the first plane, they flipped a coin to determine who would be trying it the first time. And it didn't matter if it came up heads or tails, because neither one of them could be qualified. No human is qualified to do something the first time we do it. All human progress is made by people who are unqualified. So, some of you will find yourselves on that invisible line. You'll find yourself at the edge of what humanity has done. This won't happen often. But occasionally you will run into a problem where you can't copy a solution. You can't find somebody else who's had a similar problem and has figured it out. And you'll have to ask yourself whether or not you're willing to cross that line. And what I'm here to tell you is that the good news is that there's an entirely different set of physics on that other side of the line. A set of physics that you are not familiar with, but can give you superpowers. I wish you a safe flight.